Welcome, everybody. Let's get started. Welcome you and thank you for attending today's webinar on the economics of integrity. What's it really worth? My name is Sherry Graham. I am a CPA and certified compliance and ethics professional. I am also the Chief Operating Officer at FactRight. You are in for a treat today with my guest, Christy Grant Hart. In a minute, I'll introduce Christy, but first, let's go through a couple of housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded so you can watch it again or share it with colleagues. Copies of the webinar will be available to registered subscribers of the FactRight Report Center. If you are not already a subscriber, please do so. All you have to do is navigate to the FactRight website, which is factright.com, and click the link to the Report Center. It's free of charge to due diligence professionals, and it's very easy registration process. I expect today's presentation to last about 45 minutes or so. After the presentation, we will have time for a question and answer session. Please note, you have a webinar dashboard on the GoToWebinar screen if you are attending the webinar online platform. Questions can be submitted at any time during the webinar via the questions pane. I will be available to answer questions via the questions pane and can hopefully address any immediate technical concerns you might have. Questions pertaining to the presentation will be held until the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, for those of you who may have called in, you are muted and I cannot unmute you. But if you email me after the session, I'm at Sherry, C-H-A-R-I, at factright.com. I'll be happy to follow up after the webinar. Also, please note that there is a PDF presentation in the dashboard handout section of the GoToWebinar where you can view the presentation or download it. We will be seeking your feedback at the end of the presentation, so before you exit, there will be a window that comes up with a very short evaluation to complete. I'm thanking you in advance for completing that. FactRight wants to make sure we continue to bring quality and relevant content to our audience, so please complete it. On today's presentation with me is Ms. Christy Grant Hart. She is an expert on corporate compliance and literally travels the globe bringing compliance process, discipline, and execution to firms, very small firms to highly regulated companies that are dispersed across the globe. Today she is joining us from London, which is her home base, where she is a transplanted American. However, you really know, as we discussed just briefly before the webinar, actually where Christy is, because she's always on the go. Christy Grant Hart is the Managing Director of Spark Compliance Consulting, which is a noted compliance and ethics firm. Spark Compliance Consulting focuses on creating, energizing, and optimizing corporate compliance and data privacy programs. Christy is the author of How to Be a Wildly Effective Compliance Officer, which I have personally read and highly recommend. Christy is an adjunct professor at Delaware Law School, Widener University, teaching compliance and ethics, global compliance and ethics. Ms. Grant Hart was previously the Chief Compliance Officer at United International Pictures, which is the joint distribution company for Paramount Pictures and Universal Pictures in more than 65 countries. Prior to that, Christy was with Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, where she worked in the firm's Los Angeles and London offices. She is an experienced international conference speaker and has published many articles in magazines and trade publications, both in the United States and Europe, on anti-bribery topics and on data privacy and data transfer. Christy has advised Fortune 500 companies on international compliance and has created and revamped compliance programs for major companies in Europe and the United States. She is also a corporate compliance and ethics professional and is a member of the California Bar Association. The only disappointment I have today is that we do not use video capabilities for our educational webinars. Given her extensive talent with audiences and presentations, she is delightful to see in person or watch on video, both of which I've had the pleasure to do, and I encourage you as well. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Christy. Thank you, Christy.
Thank you so much. I mean, my goodness, I hope I live up to the to the intro. So today we are talking about the economics of integrity and ethics and what they're really worth. So I'm coming to you, as you found out, from London, where there is a company that once upon a time long ago was Britain's most admired business. It won that award 10 years in a row between 2000 and 2010. Then there was a supplier mistreatment scandal where individuals who were in the farming industry in Britain came out and said, we have 90-day payment terms. We are not able to make a living based on what you're doing to us, and squeezing every little cent, every last cent out of the suppliers, where people started to boycott Tesco and not go there anymore. Then they had a financial misstatement crisis where maybe they hadn't done any of their reporting properly and several people were fired very publicly. And after that, there was the horse meat scandal, where it was found that the meat in the beef lasagna wasn't so much beef, but horse. This combined for a reputational destruction lasting for several years and costing the company an estimated $13.5 billion in reputational and shared damage. How much is the economics of integrity and ethics worth? Well, if you ask Tesco, it's worth at least 13.5 billion pounds. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about multiple facets of this problem of ethics and integrity and try to get our hands around what they're really worth. As you know, I am a compliance officer really first and foremost in my heart, but I also do professional speaking about my book and about compliance topics, as well as running Spark Compliance Consulting, which is London and Los Angeles based and about to open in Atlanta, focusing on anti-bribery programs and also on the anti-bribery ISO 37001 certification for anti-bribery systems. So what are we going to talk about today in detail? Well, we're going to talk about, of course, the financial cost of what happens when things go wrong. But we're also going to talk about the emotional cost and the reputational cost, because I think people all too often think, well, these fines are terrible. Yeah, they are. But there's also a financial effect of having a workplace of integrity that is different than just the fines, and we'll talk about that a lot. We're also going to talk about the emotional cost, because people think of fines, they think of the damage, but they don't think about the effect on the employees when you have a low trust, low ethics, low integrity environment. We're going to talk about reputational cost, and then the rest of the webinar is going to be about doing things the right way. So lots of tips about how to grow your own personal integrity, but also to grow the trust of others. So it's both from your personal perspective, your benefits to yourself, but also how to create that within your company or organization so that you end up with a more positive place. Well, let's start out with the financial cost. So Ralph Waldo Emerson said, our distrust is very expensive. But is it? Is distrust expensive? Does it actually cost anything to be in a low trust, low integrity environment? I'll give you an example why I think this is absolutely a problem. One of my clients had a suspicious payment in one of the Middle Eastern countries. The payment was for $20,000 US, and they were concerned that it might be a bribe. The subsequent investigation, including alerting the Department of Justice, cost $8 million, and ultimately the payment was found not to be a bribe. But that environment where they were concerned about it, where they had to get all the law firms involved and the government involved, that $20,000 became an $8 million problem. That kind of situation can be avoided if we have a higher trust environment and the right controls in place. So let me talk to you about why I think that there is a financial cost to integrity. And when I say integrity, I obviously mean the traditional form of it, doing the right thing. But I also mean an environment of high trust, because high trust and high integrity environments tend to go together, and low trust, low integrity environments tend to go together. And Stephen Covey Jr. wrote this wonderful book where he talks about the speed of trust and how important that financially can be on companies and firms. So he has this great equation that I love where he says if trust goes up, then speed goes up and costs go down. And simultaneously, when trust goes down, speed goes down and costs go up. Let me give you an example of this. Imagine that you have been tasked with getting the paper for your whole company next year. You've been working with company X, who has done a great job. You're happy with them. They deliver on time. But now you're also talking through your procurement function to company Y. Company Y is a little bit cheaper, but you've been warned that friends of yours have worked with Company Y and they didn't deliver on time and the product wasn't really as promised. Maybe some of it was missing, maybe some of it was defective, they had to send some back. When you're negotiating this contract, if you go with supplier X, you aren't going to worry about every single detail in the contract and whether or not it's airtight and how much your liquidated damages will be if they get it wrong and how much you need to pad that so that you might have to have legal expenses, or if they deliver late, what are the damages for that? You can just take the contract. Whereas if you go with company Y, what do? You have a low trust environment. You are much more likely to spend time, and lots of it, working on the contract, negotiating the deal, coming to it from a position of, I don't trust you, I need to have things in place that make me feel better. So when you think about it that way, when you have high trust, the speed of deals, the speed of business goes up and costs go down. Whereas when you have to think about something and you really have to put in safeguards and you have to worry, trust goes down, speed goes down, costs go up. One of the things I see companies do all the time is they zero rate the time of their employees. So in other words, they think that their employees, since they already work there, their time is free, basically, or simply paid for. But actually, if you think about the employee's time as being worth whatever they're paid, their salary divided by however many hours they're working, those costs are real, and it's not just the cost of the paper. That low trust environment is actually creating something where there is true financial cost for the problem. And that distrust creates an enormous, enormous problem for businesses. And what Covey calls this is the trust tax. So he says that when there is a low trust environment, we pay a tax. We pay a tax in terms of time that we have to negotiate. We pay a tax frequently in terms of how much money is spent on the problem or how many different types of vendors we need to contact. There is an actual cost that happens in this. And that low environment, the low trust environment, is something that we want to counter and something that we're going to talk about how to build a higher trust, higher integrity environment as we go through the webinar. But it's not just in business. When we look at surveys, there are some really fascinating descriptions and surveys from people throughout business and throughout the world about their experience of whether they're in a high or low trust environment. For instance, 29% of employees believe that management cares about them developing their skills. So we get this message from the HR department all the time. We care about developing your skills. Well, do you? Only 29% of employees believe that that's true. 36%, those are the employees that believe their leaders act with honesty and integrity. So the other 64%, they don't think so. The majority thinks that leaders do not act with honesty or integrity. Next, 42%. Only 42% believe that management cares about them at all. Where you have these super low trust environments, you have distrust and you have people second guessing and you have disengagement, which has been found to actually lower profits. Where you have engaged employees, you have much more likelihood of good profits and of shareholder value and return. And lastly, this is my scary number, 76%. So over the past 12 months, 76% of employees have observed illegal or unethical conduct on the job, which, if exposed, would seriously violate public trust. So what does this show together? These statistics and the large nationwide survey that they come from show just how bad the situation is in most companies. Now, what I'm hoping for everyone listening to me on this webinar is that you find a space and a way to overcome this, because this is scary, and we want to be in a situation where we believe in the ethics and integrity, not only of our leaders, but of our coworkers, our subordinates, and ourselves. And when you look at this question of trust, it's really interesting to see that trust is, and the development of trust is different in different countries. So recently there was a British sociologist called David Halpern, and he asked people a very interesting question. Can other people be trusted? And what's interesting is that the numbers are different in different countries. So in the United States, only 34% of people believe that others can be trusted. Next, Latin America, an average of 23% of people believe that other people can be trusted. In Africa, that goes down to 18%, kind of a problem. Whereas in Britain, we're at 29%. And lastly, in the Nordics, it's at 60%. And what's interesting is over time, this sociologist has looked at the trends, and actually in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, in the Nordic countries, their trust has improved. And I think that this is interesting from a number of perspectives. One of them being that if you look at the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, what you'll see is that in the lower trust countries, corruption is more rampant and people trust each other less. So when you look at what compliance and ethics are doing, you're going to see that actually higher trust environments are really beneficial in a number of ways. For instance, in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, we have some of the lowest rates of corruption and lowest perceived rates of corruption in the entire world. And they have greater trust in each other, which of course comes back to that trust tax. If you don't have the trust tax, business gets done faster and better, which I think anybody looking at the bottom line would prefer. So what happens in this low trust environment, low integrity environment that is actually actively expensive? Covey describes in his book this 3-meeting paradigm, and I love this. I have seen this so many times in different businesses. Let's say that you are going to, you hear that there's a very important meeting on Wednesday where a critical decision is going to be made. And you're going to be at this meeting with 10 people. So what do you do on Monday? You get together with 2 of your friends and you pre-meet, right? You talk about what's going to happen at the Wednesday meeting. You try to make decisions. You come up with how you're going to fight for your position. You're all going to be in it together. Okay, great. That takes an hour at least. Then on Wednesday, we have the big meeting. Everybody comes together. The 10 people are there. You have the real meeting where you're supposed to make the decision. Everybody talks. Everyone negotiates. You all come up with a decision, maybe. And then by Friday, you have your actual meeting where the decision is made, where everyone talks about what happened or complains about it. And actually it took 3 times as long to make the decision because people didn't trust that they could simply show up to the meeting, talk from their real point of view, and that those decisions could be made transparently. So it's another example of that trust tax. Instead of having 1 meeting, the company is now paid for 3, and the decision's not been made any better or faster, whereas more work could be done. And that's part of the financial cost that people don't necessarily think about, but that it's pervasive in organizations. One of the clients that I consult with has a culture where nobody wants to be blamed, so no one will make a decision. And that is also a trust tax issue. If you don't feel like you can make mistakes and come back and still be successful at your work, you don't take risks. If you don't take risks, you are not going to innovate. Your business isn't going to succeed at the way that it could. So all of this comes back to a low trust, low integrity environment, and that has a real financial cost. Which brings me to the cost of compliance. So I think that some ethicists are fascinating people. There are a few that have posited that if we had a fully ethical business environment, that there would be no need for compliance officers or compliance professionals. And I find that fascinating. and maybe a little bit threatening until I remember that that's probably never going to happen, because we continue to see all these corporate scandals, no matter how good our compliance programs are. And I think that comes right back to low trust, low integrity environments. And what do we do in response to that, in response to the scandals? We pass laws, because that's the best way to try to control everything. But those laws, again, are very expensive. So when you look at, say, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which I know you're all familiar with, when it was proposed, there was a cost estimate. And that cost estimate for one section was $35 billion, 28 times greater than the SEC believed it was going to be to implement. So we get these laws that are trying to compensate for low trust environments by making sure that companies behave themselves, and it's really not as effective as actually having good corporate culture. So, of course, the prime example of this, which everyone has read about, is the Wells Fargo case. And this case and the meeting minutes and everything that came out of it is so fascinating. So we know that there's $150 million in fines, and we know that there's 5,300 people who lost their jobs. But I loved and was fascinated by some of the human stories that came out of this. The New York Times published an article about a woman in Seattle who had a daycare center, and she wanted to expand her daycare center, but she needed a mortgage on the building to do it. So she went to Wells Fargo and asked for a $15,000 loan to renovate, and they said, no, but we can give you a $5,000 loan. She said, no, I don't want a $5,000 loan, and went to another bank to try to get the full amount. She was later told that she couldn't have the full amount because Wells Fargo had processed the loan. And the reason they'd processed the loan was because the person who was under tremendous pressure to hit their sales goals thought that they would do it anyway, because it was easier to do that and not lose their job. And one of the challenges of a low trust, low integrity environment is that people don't look at the consequences when they're just looking at the finances. And so I would encourage you to think about the financial costs are not just fines. They're also replacing all of the people that have lost their jobs, and the reputational damage, which we'll talk about a little bit later, can be absolutely killer. I love this quote from Professor John Whitney at Columbia. He says, mistrust doubles the cost of doing business. And I think that that's been incredibly obvious. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about the Volkswagen, Porsches, et cetera, of the world, who used to be the darlings of the German economy and everyone loving them. And what has happened is the Wall Street Journal described it as pariah state, where people don't want to be associated with them because of all of the corporate scandal. And that tarnishing of your brand reputation, but also the financing, is incredibly, incredibly harmful. I read an in-depth look at what happened at Volkswagen, and one of the most interesting parts to me about the corporate culture was that the leadership would often say, if you can't fix this problem for me, I will find someone who can, or I'll fire you and find someone who will. And when you have an environment where ethics have completely left the building, and it's simply about getting things done to get them done because of the bottom line, you lose something so critical. You lose people's trust and ability to do their jobs well. And that comes out. That comes out at the seams. That comes out at the product. That comes out when people understand they don't want to work there anymore. So that is a financial cost of doing business in a way that, frankly, just doesn't make any kind of sense when you look at it. But like I said earlier, it's not just about finances. It's also about human emotion. Human emotion is, frankly, much more interesting to me than just money. Money's great, love money, but we also have to think about what are the benefits and drawbacks of your trust in your environment. And there's been really interesting sociological studies about this. So in one study, they looked at both the benefits to a company or organization of being in a high trust environment. And what they found was that in high trust environments, the company has materially improved communication, collaboration, execution, innovation, strategy, engagement, partnering, and relationships with all stakeholders. So I don't know about you, but I hear those buzzwords, right? Innovation, strategy, all those value statements that so many companies want to put out in the world as the thing they aspire to, or their personal values and the values of their employees. When they all come back to this idea of trust and integrity, when you have that, the innovation and the strategy and the ability to take risks becomes part of your corporate culture, and materially impacts your bottom line and also the emotional health of your employees. And when people have good emotional health at work, they tend to take it home with them. And what the study found in terms of people in their personal life, that a high trust environment improves the individual's excitement level, energy level, their passion, creativity, and their joy in their relationships with family, friends, and community. So this idea that there is an emotional element to how trusting your environment is, which comes down to whether or not your business operates well, is incredibly important. And you cannot have a high trust environment in a place where there are no ethics, or where people don't behave in congruent ways to what they say. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. How do you combat this and make sure you're doing it correctly? There is a fantastic quote that the Mafia has, which is, "Punish one, teach 100." And I love this quote because it goes both ways. When you show who you are as a corporation, your employees are watching. So one of the biggest things that corporations struggle with, in my consulting work, I see it all the time, is this idea of institutional justice. And what institutional justice means is that people at the bottom don't get treated like the people at the top. So if you had an ethical lapse, let's say you own stores, retail stores, and one of your employees steals $25 from the till, that person would be fired, but that someone in senior management lying about $25 of reimbursable expenses will either not be caught, told to not do it again, or it won't matter. That idea of whatever your policy is, it needs to be followed throughout your organization is something that is really, really, really important to create a high trust, high integrity environment. And people fall down on this. And I see it particularly with lawyers. I am a lawyer, I love lawyers, but when compliance goes up against legal and HR to say, well, this person has behaved badly and they're too senior, so we just want to have a nice non-disclosure agreement, everybody gets out, nobody says anything, we'll give them a good reference. This tells everybody else in the organization, many of whom will know what happened, that there is no institutional justice and that people don't have to follow the rules. So when you punish one, you teach 100, good and bad, what you are meaning when you say what you say. So acting with integrity means actually being just throughout your organization. One of the organizations that I have consulted with had a manager, a senior manager in Italy. And this manager started to collude with one of the other competitors and started to commit fraud. And people knew about it. And what the company decided to do was to say, look, it's too expensive. We don't want to do a big flashy firing thing. Let's just write an agreement with him, let him go away. We'll have a 6-month non-compete. It'll be fine. They did that. 6 months later to the day, that employee, former employee now, became the head of the biggest competitor and gave away all of their trade secrets because he had no integrity. And with that came a total disengagement of the offices in Italy because they felt like they knew he'd done wrong and he got away with it, and he also got payment to go away. People, your employees, see what's real. When you don't punish one appropriately, 100 people learn what to do. So think of the consequences and try not to listen to the people or your little voice in your head saying, don't worry, no one will ever know. People do. They're amazingly adept at figuring out what's actually going on. So let's talk a little bit about reputational risk, because I think that's some of the most interesting work that's happening these days, whether it's in social media with different hashtags that become incredibly important for people's reputational management, brand management, or shareholder activism. All of these things are combining with reputational risk. And Warren Buffett has this fabulous, fabulous quote. It takes 25 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. So what does that mean? What is reputational risk? Well, people think about it as simply being about shareholder value, which of course it is. But Mr. Covey has this great idea, this quote, "We judge ourselves by our intentions and everyone else by their behavior," which means we judge ourselves with, but I had a good reason for it, but I wanted to, but there was because they're unjust, because. You ask a bank robber why he or she robbed the bank, they will tell you that they had a good reason and that it was the right thing to do. People are amazing at coming up with self-justification for why what they did was okay. But what's interesting is everyone else watching you sees only the outcomes, right? Not the intention. They see what happened and how the person actually behaved. A very sort of everyday banal example of this happens when, let's say, your spouse, you ask your spouse to please bring home milk on the way home. And let's say that he comes home and does not have any milk. And you say, well, why not? And he says, well, I meant to, but I got distracted by this conversation at work, and then I went by the gym, and I was going to get it on the way home, but then it was kind of icy, and I wanted to be home faster, and so I'm here, but we have no milk. And he said, but I meant to. And she says, but you didn't, right? And that idea of your intentions don't matter anywhere to as much as your behavior when you are out in the real world. So think about not what your intention is, but about what that outcome, what that behavior will be, because that outcome is what determines ultimately your reputation. So we started with Tesco, and I think that it's really interesting to look at this graph. So this shows the difference between the reputational and non-reputational value of the shares. And you can see just how dramatically they went down over the time period with all these scandals. And just so you know, it's not just an issue in terms of share price. Most people think or have this idea that it's not that big deal, right? That there are new scandals every day and that scandals come and go and that everyone forgets about them and they don't matter. Okay, Stanford decided to test this theory. And what they did was they looked to see where there had been a corporate scandal involving a CEO. How long did it affect the company? And what they found was that every single one of these scandals had an average of 238 negative mentions in the media or the news that took place over 4.9 years. So where you have a CEO scandal, you have almost 5 years of bad news or mentions in the news, even though it was years ago. So that reputational effect, even if it's not measured in the share price, that continuous mention of scandal associated with your name is a gigantic problem. And what happens is your reputation is bigger than just what it is you do. So it has a ripple effect that the things that you do, your behavior, affects other people's opinion of you, even if you don't know it. So let's say on our screen we've got our two gentlemen here. We have our boss, his name is Roger, and we have his underling. And so Roger gets angry and loses his temper in a totally unprofessional way in a meeting and starts to scream at his subordinate. His subordinate will be shamed, angry, and hurt. And what happens after that is it's not just him who's mad. He goes off and he tells his friends at work how angry he is and how bad a supervisor Roger is. So now we don't just have one person being affected, we have him telling all of his friends. And those people are going to tell their friends, and pretty soon you have an environment where everybody knows about what it is you did wrong and how much you affected that environment negatively. So now your Roger is going to have more difficulty getting good employees to work for him or even for the company. And what's interesting to me is how much that reputation matters. People think their individual actions don't really matter, but actually everything a single employee is doing over the course of their employment affects not only the corporate culture, but the future reputation of the brand and of the company. And when I do keynote speeches for whole organizations, usually for their ethics and compliance day, I tell people to look at the people next to you and think about your favorite coworkers, because what you do today is going to not only affect the reputation of the company today, but also 5, 10 years time. Your LinkedIn profile, your resume is going to have the company's name on it. What is that going to be worth if you have a poor reputation for your company? And how responsible are you for making sure that doesn't happen? This idea of reputation and cheating is a catastrophic problem. So I love this. There was a survey done in an American university asking who cheated. And I think you will be slightly amazed at what the answers are. They found that in this graduating class, based on anonymous surveys, 43% of liberal arts students had cheated. 52% of the education students had cheated on an exam or had brought in crib notes or had done something unethical. 63% of medical students, oh my goodness, that terrifies me. Normally now I ask how many of the lawyers do you think cheated? And the answer is actually the exact same number as the medical students, 63%. So we have this problem where we've got sort of a social acceptance of cheating. There was this fantastic story that I love. There was an older medical student who had gone away and had a career and decided that he wanted to go to medical school. And he went into one of the first exams, and the teacher left the room, and somebody pulled out a cheat sheet and started to write from it. And this person in the back of the room, the older student, stood up and said, "No, I have worked too hard to come in here to be messed up by your cheating, and I'm not going to compete with you in that way." And for the rest of the class, everybody thought, yeah, I'm going to hold other people responsible. I'm not going to allow this to become normative. Because one of the challenges of a low trust environment is that it becomes normal. It becomes normal to be disrespectful. It becomes normalized to yell. It becomes normalized to cheat. It becomes something you see everywhere around you. That is a cost to the business as well in terms of its reputation, but also in terms of how others behave and whether or not they're held to an ethical standard that you want your corporation to be held to. So this cheating, we want to make sure it's never normalized in our business. By the way, 75% of the business students cheated in this class. Now, the only dishonest person, I love this quote so much, Captain Jack Sparrow, he says, "I'm dishonest, and a dishonest man you can always trust to be dishonest, honestly." I think part of what we need to know is who we are, and how we want to be perceived. Who do we really want to be at our core? And who we are at our core is likely to attract other people to work at our company, to be our friends, who have the same level of integrity. So one of the things you want to do is try to avoid becoming very close to the Jack Sparrows of the world, except on television where they're lots of fun. So we've talked a lot about what to do, how it can go wrong, how financially problematic it can be to have a low trust, low integrity, low ethics environment, and how emotionally damaging that can be, and at length about how reputations can be completely damaged. But what I'd like to talk about now is what can we do? How do we avoid this? What do we change in ourselves to make our environments more high trust? There's several very specific techniques that you can use. One of my favorites is telling others up front what you're going to do. So if you are going to go into a negotiation and you say to the person you're negotiating with, "I really want us to create a positive outcome and a win-win situation for both of us." If you say that up front, the other person is likely to trust you and to have a faster, better outcome to the negotiations. And they've done all kinds of testing about this. When people come in and they believe it's going to go well, they expect it to go well, they tell the other person their expectation that this can be a high trust, high integrity environment, which they say with words like, "I'm looking for a win-win, I'm hoping we can come to a great conclusion, I'm excited about meeting you and talking to you about this deal." All of those expectations create an environment where we have less trust tax and we have business that moves faster, smoother, more efficiently, and that can provide better environments for everybody. Another way that you want to be creating trust is to expect others to do the right thing. There was a fascinating small study done in a prison, and this researcher went and asked these prisoners what had been said to them when they were kids, 84% said that a teacher or parent had said to them, "You're going to end up in jail when you grow up." The expectations we set for people, they tend to live up to them. So one of the ways to create a high trust environment is to expect people to live up to what it is they're supposed to do, to expect them to be ethical, to expect them to do the right thing. And that can actually become contagious, where your entire environment has people expecting that others will behave appropriately. Then you have the opposite of the normalization. You've got it normalized to behave in an ethical way. So that expectation giving and expecting people to behave appropriately is really effective. Next, transparency, being transparent at all times. You want to act as if other people are watching you. And there's been really interesting studies done because some managers really like to keep information close to their vest. They don't like to tell anybody what's going on. They feel like sharing information makes them weaker. Where the studies have really proven that actually the more transparent a manager can be to say, this is what's going on, I don't know what the outcome is going to be, I'm doing the best that I can for you. When they are transparent, employees trust much more and you end up with much less trust tax and also less of that three-meeting paradigm. Next, most importantly, what you can do, you can also be congruent, which means you walk the walk that you say you will. When you say you're going to do something, you do it. When you say, I don't know, you mean I don't know. You want what you say to be the same as what you do. And you want to give others trust. This is similarly related to that idea of expectation. You want to expect people to do the right thing, but you also want to trust them. People hate being micromanaged, and one of the ways that you build trust is simply to give people trust and believe that they're going to do the right thing. Booker T. Washington said, "Few things can help an individual more than to place responsibility on him and to let him know that you trust him." So when we get into a high trust, high integrity environment and you're still not sure what to do, there's all kinds of models, but they all kind of come down to the same thing. They come down to this question of, how do I make decisions that are full of integrity and that support, particularly in gray area situations? The first question, is it legal? Right? If it's not legal, it's probably not the right thing. Is it consistent with our values and our code of conduct? That's the next question. Does it feel right? And would I be happy explaining what I did to my colleagues, family, and friends? My dad used to refer to this as the New York Times test. If this were on the cover of the New York Times, would I be happy about it? Would I be proud to tell my mom? Would I be uncomfortable explaining my decision to my grandma? All that sort of gut reaction. How do you feel about it really? And if you have to sit and justify things to yourself, it's probably not the right decision. And at that point, you should stop and seek guidance. So whether it's in a corporate environment with your compliance or ethics department, whether it's guidance from a religious figure or a trusted advisor, that ability to talk to somebody else about doing the right thing can really give clarity. And sometimes even just speaking out loud what it is you're thinking about doing can make a gigantic difference. So what if you haven't been a person of integrity, or you're in a low integrity environment and you're trying to figure out what to do about that? Well, I love this Chinese proverb. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. And so if you haven't been a person of integrity, you can always start today. And if your company has a culture of low trust and low ethical standards, you as an ambassador for that kind of behavior, where you can act congruently, where you can give others trust, where you can be transparent, that will affect the financial, emotional, and reputational elements within your culture and within your company. And the more that you can create that, the more effective that you'll be in creating a high trust environment. And of course, the most important thing in all of that is to be the change you want to see in the world. Thank you so much for listening to me and for having me here. I will start with any kind of questions or answers that you would like from me.
Thank you, Christy. Wonderful. You have touched on topics that not only apply to our organizations that we're part of, but each one of us individually. I think you presented it in a very comprehensible and clear way. I remember learning about what's the best way to make a decision, which you touched upon, and frankly, it makes life a lot easier to go through that process. Is this legal? Yes or no? No, you don't do it. Go on to the next step. Is it the right thing to do? Yes or no? And it really makes decision making a lot more applicable and easier for us as part of life as well as part of organizations. I have a couple of questions, Christy, for you. The first one is, which governing body do you think within an organization should be primarily responsible for an ethics compliance program?
Well, being that I have a compliance consulting company, I tend to think that compliance should be in charge. But I think that ultimately with ethics in particular, I think that it needs to be that certain situations need a group approach. So you might need somebody from HR that's working with compliance. You may need somebody from legal who's working with compliance and HR, and senior management, depending on what the issue is. I think that what happens in too many organizations is you get a very siloed approach where there's a turf war or power struggles about who's going to be in charge of what. Internal investigations tends to be very hot button. You know, HR wants to be in charge, compliance wants to be in charge, legal is controlling the outcome. And I think that trying to get into a place where we're collaborating and actually saying what's best for the organization, how can we work together? So reframing it is not, you know, that's my toy, that's your toy. How do we share the toy in the most positive way? I think that's really important for creating the kind of place where compliance and ethics can thrive. It's less about who's in charge of it and more important that someone is, that the roles are defined, and that there's a collaborative environment to try to get the best outcome for compliance and ethics issues.
Thank you, Christy. You know, we have, you explained a lot of your topics and recommendations regarding Tesco, and I'm not going to name any names, but we within the alternative investment industry have our own Tesco, and I think that everything you discussed about was really applicable and we could understand it. So what do you think are some of the best practices for responding or handling questions from employees regarding an ethics-related topic, issue, situation? What are some of the best practices? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that question. I think that this one comes back to transparency. I think that too often, you obviously, if you have a public scandal, you want your PR people on it. You want experts at communication to help you handle it. But I think, at least to the external world, but to your internal world, to your employees, I think that having a CEO with the courage to have a real town hall meeting, or somebody in the organization management to say, this is everything we are legally allowed to tell you. This is how our organization has changed, and not just our policies, but how we approach things has changed because of this scandal. I think that people are desperate for information and for leadership during times of scandal or crisis. And the people who step up and are transparent and congruent and really mean what they say, you can come through almost any kind of scandal. I mean, Tesco itself has actually done really quite well at fixing its problems and trying to fix the reputation. And I think that very few companies are beyond help, but you really need a shift in that mentality about how transparent you're going to be, what kind of ethical leadership you're going to have, how your policies and training and those things are going to change. But sort of the mea culpa, like, we messed this up, and what are we going to do about it? And I think that people are remarkably forgiving when you have a genuine contriteness and say, we got this wrong, here's what we're going to do about it, and they can get on board with you.
Thanks, Christy. Remarkably forgiving is what you stated. However, it might take them, as you said, 5 years to forgive. So that's
Well, the outside world might take 5 years to forgive, but the inside world, in terms of your employee base, which is really where you need it to start, if they're gonna leave, they're gonna leave, right? But if the ones who stay, you want to tell them that this is going to be different, and it may take a very long time for the outside world to believe you. But if you want your company to succeed in the meantime, your employees have to believe you that it's changed and that they can work in the environment in a way that isn't going to threaten their reputation any further.
Well said. Great advice. Great advice. What do you think, Christy, where would you recommend individuals go for some additional resources regarding ethics and compliance and this very important function?
Yeah, well, I think that the Institute of Business Ethics, it's a UK-based organization, but they have great materials about ethical decision-making, business ethics. They have some really interesting advice, and they're usually shortened to IBE, or Institute of Business Ethics. But I think that's a terrific place to go. The Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, of which I am a board member, has some really terrific compliance and ethics materials, and they have a magazine called Ethicos that deals with ethics topics. But frankly, a lot of what you can do is just read the paper. Think about how these situations played out, find out what went wrong, the sort of corporate documents that eventually many companies have to put out saying, this was terrible. What can we learn from that? Looking for patterns, I think, is important and critical. And the more that you can start to spot them, the more you can apply to your own organization to see red flags early so they don't fester into gigantic problems.
Wonderful, wonderful. This is so applicable to both the business and personal life. It just permeates through almost everything that we do. So thank you very much, Christy. I thank you for putting the presentation together. I would like to remind everyone that the webinar is recorded. It's going to be available to you in the report center. We very much appreciate your time and attention. A note, don't forget attendees to register for the Fact Right Due Diligence Conference that's coming up in September. It is free of charge for both travel and attendance to most due diligence professionals. I highly recommend the attendees to this webinar to visit Christy at sparkcompliance.com. You've got a plethora of resources there, both in papers, topics, wonderful. Again, thank you, Christy, very much for putting this presentation together for us, and I thank everyone.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you very much, Christy. Take
Bye.
care.